spicy. Not because you want to, but you have to. Be bold and no time to be bashful. Grab life by the horns like a natural. Be sharp, be quick, and be agile. Never ever let a competitor catch you. Stay ahead of whatever is trying to pass you. Though it's not a race, sometimes that's how you gotta operate.
Hello everybody, Samuel Ray, aka Dr. Sam here. Welcome to the Morning Boot Up. Solo segment, I should say, where I sit down with my morning coffee and just ramble on about whatever topic is on my mind. Though to be fair, with the way I talk, the rambles are always somewhat structured, even though this is not a scripted segment. I generally don't like scripts, actually. At most I use bullet points to get the main points, and then I just go off the cuff. But this morning I'm a little sniffly. Allergies are acting up, so please forgive if I clear my throat a lot. This week I wanted to talk about a topic that kind of springboards off of last week's topic. So last week I spoke of player freedom in games. So this week I want to talk about the opposite side of the coin, and that would be restrictions. Well, restrictions, or put another way, regulations or rules, however you want to say it. Because last week I talked all about how player freedom is important and the various aspects of it. This week I want to talk about how game developers using rules or regulations or restrictions, how in a game that can be a positive thing if done right. So to get it out of the way first, we're not talking about restrictions that simply exist to be an inconvenience to the player for the sake of it. I don't think anyone actually has fun, or at the very least, not anyone, but a majority of people don't have fun when there are mechanics meant to hinder them, simply to hinder them, or for the sake of, realism or whatever. And we're talking about people who play video games. We're not talking about simulators, because simulators are a completely different niche that is comparably small and appeals to a very hardcore subset of people, a very restricted audience. So we're not talking about, like, say, your racing simulators or your flight simulators. Those are meant to imitate reality as closely as possible for the technology at the time of development. That's a different matter altogether. And, those can do their own thing, What I'm talking about is, take for example, you compare Monster Hunter from Monster Hunter Generations and back to the original, compare that to Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise. There's a lot of gameplay design elements and mechanics that punish the player if they don't participate in them. For example, and I've mentioned this in the past, but hot and cold drinks during the preparation step. If you're going to a cold environment and you don't drink a hot drink first, and you don't bring extra hot drinks because they don't last for the entire hunt, so you don't drink a hot drink before you depart, immediately before you depart, and then you don't have an extra one or two in your pouch, then you're constantly at a disadvantaged state. If I remember correctly, you're like losing health slowly or something like that. And like maybe your maximum health and stamina, or your max stamina or something like that, is capped a little lower. So either way, it's a mechanic that you have to engage with just to operate at baseline capacity. The same capacity that you're operating in all other maps. And then, it's, with hot drinks, cold drinks, it's the inverse. Cold drinks when going to like a volcano type area. Same results though. that's a mechanic that not many people actually like. Like, there are some, you know, of the old school fans of Monster Hunter who will stand by that and say that they miss it and all that because it was more immersive. But that, I stand by that being a design element where immersion sacrificed fun. Because it's something that, like I said, if you don't engage with it, you're operating at sub-standard capacity. The game forces you to be at a disadvantage, to, you know, it penalizes you for not doing it. Rather than using the rules and restrictions to enhance the game, all it does is take away from it for the sake of immersion, in which case it's not a mechanic that sparks joy. So it being taken out in more recent Monster Hunters, starting with Monster Hunter World, overall ended up being an improvement that, among many other, you know, quality of life and convenience factors, made them the most successful Monster Hunter games in the history of the franchise. And for good reason, because they streamlined or took out a lot of things that pushed people away from them. And like the clunkiness of the combat. Now, if you compare that to something like, say, Dark Souls, some people say that the clunkiness, like for example, when you initiate an attack, you have to let the entire attack animation for that swing of your weapon follow through to completion before you can do any other action like dodge rolling out of the way or moving again. That's a restriction that, rather than being intended to simply inconvenience the player, is a mechanic that adds challenge and adds depth, because now you're making the players think about their actions, act with intention and follow through, and commit to the action, instead of being able to just dodge cancel at any time, like in your, I don't know, Bayonetta type game. So in a game like Monster Hunter and Dark Souls, when you're attacking and it's a big slow attack, you better make sure you do it at the right time, otherwise you could get punished. That it becomes when the player figures out the mechanic, figures out the game feel, and starts to play around that. It adds that strategic depth and becomes a rewarding experience. It enhances the experience once you engage with it. It doesn't detract from the experience when you don't engage with it, because it's a core mechanic. It's not an optional thing that can be changed, and the core of the game remains the same. If in Dark Souls you could attack, dodge, cancel anytime, it would be very trivial. Difficulty that it's known for would become very trivialized. It's that committal attacking and moving and dodging that emphasizes timing and adds strategic depth and intention and all of that stuff that gives you that challenge and that rewarding feeling of overcoming the challenge. But it's not so restricted that you're stuck with just one weapon through the entire game or one gear set, and you have to figure out this, you know, patterns. You can choose faster weapons that, you know, do less damage per strike, but have faster attacks, so therefore you have more opportunities to dodge and move. Or you can use big, lumbering, slower weapons that hit like a truck, but are even more committal. Player choice is still there. Player freedom is still there to find something that suits them. But it's still all designed around the restrictions of committal animations. And that marriage becomes an excellently balanced and rewarding experience. So that's a case where the restrictions make the end product better. Another example, I would say, definitely lies in the fighting game genre, which I have more than 20 years of experience with. Now, in more recent times, or after a certain point, when your more flashy, bombastic fighting games became more popular, and then the game design tendencies or trends started to influence the majority of the genre. Things shifted. So if you look at the original one that started everything, the boom of the genre in the golden years was Street Fighter 2. And that game was built around your projectile, well, the specials anyways, the projectile, the uppercut, and then like the forward traveling move. And then of course your normal attacks. And it was very much a game of spacing, using far-reaching buttons, using projectiles, uppercuts to catch people jumping, or as an invincible reversal against people trying to be too aggressive on the ground, and so on. So it created like a dance of mind games between two players. Now, once you start getting into games that have like air dashing and forward running instead of just a little step dash to cover a bit more distance, like a full-on sprint is what we're talking about. And you start adding extra meters, resource bars and mechanics that use those offensively, defensively, what have you. The games became faster, combos got longer, aggressive pressure became stronger, while blocking was then punished and penalized more. As I mentioned in last week's episode, sometimes completely penalized for playing defensively, like in Guilty Gear and Street Fighter V, and all the games that those two have inspired over the last, I would say, decade. Those games, it seems like the developers said, let's remove tons of the restrictions from aggressive play, but impose more restrictions upon defensive play. But giving not enough, or giving too much freedom to offensive play and not imposing enough restrictions in these cases creates games that only appeal to a small amount of people, or a certain type of people, I should say, not a small amount, because let's be honest, the majority attention span has become quite short in modern years. As the years go on, the average attention span has been shrinking. In my lifetime, I've seen it. I grew up as a child who, at the age of, 2? My mom could give me some toys, put on a Disney movie, and I'd be good for like 2 hours. Just keep myself entertained for 2 hours. My mom actually had more trouble getting me to stop playing and go to the restroom than she had having me keep my attention on one thing. So throughout my entire life, I've always had a much higher than average attention span. That's just been me naturally. And later on in life, as I got into things like, growing up doing the lightsaber fights, because I love Star Wars, or at least I grew up loving Star Wars, starting with the original trilogy, which I also had the attention span to watch as a child. And my brother did as well, and so we would do the lightsaber fights all the time with the toy lightsabers. So many times hitting each other in the face or the hands with those plastic lightsabers. But still, great times, good memories. I always was inherently a more defensive player, or fighter. I was more like a fencer. I was keeping, my distance with the tip of the lightsaber blade. I was not very often the one initiating offense. I was usually the one reacting to someone else's offense, looking for gaps and holes in their offense, and then striking at those weak points with precision. That was my game plan. That's just what came naturally to me. So in fighting games, I kind of became a defensive outboxer type. In Smash Brothers, for example, I used to compete in that on the Wii U. My main was Marth, spacing at the tip of the sword for the strongest hits, keeping the opponent at sword's reach, punishing their attempts at approaching, and then taking advantage of, hits that I got into applying some pressure, and then after applying some pressure, backing off a bit and establishing space and control over the level. That was my style. In traditional fighting games, though, that's a lot more difficult to do, and not the biggest reason for it is because of how these games over the last 10 years or so have been designed to disincentivize or penalize me for trying to play that way. So like Guilty Gear stuff, placing too many restrictions in the wrong ways on play styles, not giving enough player freedom, like I mentioned last week, and then giving too much freedom to offensive play and not placing enough restrictions on that. Because the average person, if there's not much action happening on screen within 6 seconds, they get bored. I mean, that's just, I'm just gonna put it bluntly. The average attention span is around 6 to 12 seconds. So if you compare that to what I consider a much more respectable combat sport, boxing, right? Now, let's look at how boxing approaches restrictions and rules and regulations, right? So, in boxing, there are some core tenets. No below the belt strikes. So that restricts where you can throw your punches to the waist and up. So you're mostly striking, the stomach and abs, the sides, the arms and shoulders, the chest, and the face. You would think by restricting where you can strike, that reduces the amount of depth and complexity in the sport, right? But that's actually wrong. So by adding those restrictions, you know where the opponent can strike you. You know where they're allowed to strike you. So then that gives you the ability to think to yourself of where they're going to likely strike at. And that can differ from person to person based on their style, their training, and so on. Their technique, all of that, and just simple preference. And you can use that information, or educated guesses at least, to formulate a defensive strategy, to shore up your defenses for the areas that your opponent's likely going to strike. But then your opponent knows that you know. So then they will try to play mind games and maybe mix things up a bit. Do stuff they aren't necessarily known for doing in order to catch you off guard. That's what is called in Japan yomi. That's the layers of the mind game. And that's increased when you introduce restrictions. Because if you compare to like MMA, mixed martial arts fighting, you can strike on pretty much anywhere on the body, except for, I think, the groin. So it's a lot harder to know where your opponent's going to strike, especially if you're fighting against a well-rounded opponent. They could be kicking you in the legs, they could be striking at the face, they could be striking at the midsection. And unlike boxing, grabbing and grappling is a thing. So they could grapple you and strike you, they could grapple you and try to take you down to the ground to gain a severe advantage against you. There's so much that the aggressor can do that being the defender is much more difficult, which inherently skews the risk reward in favor of the aggressor. But in boxing, having more restrictions, above the belt only, no grabbing unless you wrap your both arms around the opponent in the clinch up, which if you clinch up for a certain amount of time, a certain amount of seconds, then the ref makes you split up and that's a reset to neutral. No one has advantage. So by introducing those restrictions, you actually emphasize the mind games. Fewer options means more balance in risk reward between offense and defense. Fewer areas to strike means more opportunities to defend against those, or more likelihood that you can properly defend against those strikes. And then the mind games, the layers of mind games of, okay, well, he thinks I'm going to strike here, so I'm going to strike there instead. And that creates a more balanced and, in my opinion, a more complex and more deep sport that emphasizes the interactions between the fighters and their technique rather than emphasizing aggression. And we know that though, in boxing has more of this problem than MMA does, where people complain about defensive fighters like Mayweather. Though we know that that's because of the modern attention span, because back in the day when Muhammad Ali earned his titles and was named one of the greatest of all time, and at his time, the greatest of all time, he was a defensive boxer. The structure of the sport added just enough restrictions that he was able to play his defensive playstyle, but not so many restrictions that it disallowed him from playing his defensive playstyle. And that's the difference. You need to find that balance. While you don't want to give one side too much freedom while imposing too much restriction on another, and you don't want to restrict everyone too much, because then it becomes too much inconvenience factors and that can decrease most people's fun. You want to find that middle ground, especially when it's player versus player. When it's competition, you need restrictions and structure to facilitate fair competition. Otherwise, the results hold no merit. So by that logic, I literally see less value in a fighting game or any competitive game that heavily rewards one playstyle over other playstyles by design. By design, you should structure your rules, regulations, gameplay, mechanics, all of that around being as balanced as you can to as many playstyles as you can. That way, players have enough player freedom to express their technique and creativity and playstyle preference, their own skill set through their playstyle of choice, rather than being pigeonholed into one. So you get that player freedom, like I mentioned last week, but you need just enough restrictions that one playstyle, most often aggression, isn't emphasized or rewarded too much more than other playstyles, often defensive, so that you have more structure, so you have more fairness, more balance, and more competitive integrity. Now in single player, like I mentioned earlier, restrictions can create challenge, because if you make the player have so much freedom and so much power that when they're going against the, in a player versus environment situation against the computer, the CPU, or AI, or however you want to say it, and the player is just so overpowered compared to all of the, non-player character enemies they're going against, there is no challenge. It's trivial. And that reduces the rewarding feeling of completing it, which reduces most people's reason for even playing. Something like that, And we're talking action games, of course. Games with some sort of action challenge. I mean, heck, if we're talking puzzle games, let's look at Tetris, right? The most played video game of all time, if I remember correctly, or one of anyway. Tetris only works as a puzzle game because there are restrictions. The block's always falling. You can, in some iterations, slow it or speed it up, or make it snap down instantly, but you can never stop its descent, the descent of a tetramino. You also are restricted into the patterns of each tetramino piece. You don't get to just choose what you get. Some iterations have a hold system where you can swap the one you're currently using with one that's in reserve, but you can't just freely choose what blocks you get. And there's set rules. You have to create solid lines to get rid of them. There's no working around that. There's no alternatives. That's core to the game. Puzzle games only work because the players are restricted. If they could just place anything, choose anything to place it wherever they want, there would be no challenge. There's only challenge because there's restriction. And that restriction adds structure. And so you have these falling pieces, you're rotating them according to the options are given, and you kind of head best you can with the preview for what's coming next. and you got your hold in some iterations, and players get good at it. And I mean, most people I've known, like, I remember a study that said that for some reason Tetris triggers the dopamine centers in the brain of a woman more so than the brain of a man. Not sure why. I'm not going to go into the why. I'm not entirely sure. It seems similar to chocolate. You know, chocolate doesn't trigger dopamine nearly as much in the brain of a man as does a woman, on average. I've known women who hate chocolate though, and I've known some who are allergic. So obviously it doesn't apply to everyone. But as a commonality, it holds true. And Tetris is a game that anyone can enjoy. But it's only as fun as it is and as deep as it is and challenging because there's restriction and structure. You know, and any puzzle game, like I said, a puzzle game cannot exist if there's no restrictions. You have to be restricted in order for it to be a puzzle. In general. And like many things in life have structure. You know, structure in a way comes from objectivity. Because you take math, for example. 2 + 2 = 4. You can't change that. You are restricted to the rules of the numbers. The numbers are what they are. You know, there's no subjectivity to that. You are restricted to those numbers. 2 is 2. 2 cannot be equal to 4. So, structure is a part of existence. It's a part of reality. It's a part of life. Without structure, you have chaos and, you know, usually to a negative result. So in games, you need structure. You need some restrictions in order to create any kind of challenge or depth or facilitate freedom. It's interesting, but structure, there's a phrase in game design, limitation breeds creativity. And that is so true. Some of the most creative video games of all time, of history, some of the most notable innovations have come from game developers working around the limitations that they have to deal with, whether that be limitations coming from the publisher, the company that's going to be selling the game that they're making, restrictions coming from the hardware that they're designing for, you know, the current generation console and PC hardware, restrictions coming from the budget they have to work with. No video game project has an infinite budget, so they have a restriction, a limitation there, budget constraints, limitations that come from their personal abilities. You know, not every game developer is skilled or proficient at certain aspects of game development. You know, a programmer is not always going to be a skilled artist. An artist is not always going to be a skilled mechanical planner, and so on. Limitations are a part of life. Limitations are a part of everything we do. Not everybody is skilled at everything. You know, I am skilled at public speaking, at platformer games because I grew up on them. You know what games I am awful at? I'm pretty bad at shooters, at most shooters, especially first-person shooters. I am just not great at them. I'm not. Never have been. I mean, there was a period of time where I was pretty decent at Halo, but that was a console exclusive one, and I just had the time to play it. But I wouldn't say I was one of the best. When I competed in Smash Brothers for Wii U, some of my region's best players, I always gave them a run for their money. They always had to work hard against me, and I usually took it to last hit, last stock, and last match of the set. So I always pulled it pretty close, even though I had much less experience, competitive experience than them. And they told me that I had potential to be on their level easily as long as I, you know, grinded more, got more matchup knowledge, and just refined my skills. Of course, at the time, it was right before I was starting my college career education, so I had to stopped competing because I just simply didn't have the time for it. But I had the potential there. I had the skill set, apparently. You know, but there are some other things I'm not great at too. You know, in games, I'm actually not the best at all puzzle games. If I play Tetris or Puyo Puyo against my mom, more often than not, she's going to win. She's just better at them. Hard stop. She's always been the best in my family at puzzle games. But she's not that great at action games. And she never really attempts to play them because of it. She just doesn't enjoy them. But she enjoys platformers because she played them with me when I was a kid. It's just, that's how it is. We all have restrictions placed upon us. Not everybody can be good at everything. However, it's those restrictions and limitations that cause us to excel at other things, or to cause us to gain new skill sets by learning to work around those restrictions or limitations. That's what sets people apart, you know? Instead of letting those restrictions and limitations just hold you down, find ways around them. Don't call for less restrictions every time, like some of these people wanting less restrictions in the games. No, figure out how you can work around those restrictions first, because those restrictions are what give you balance and challenge and depth and a reason to even play the game. Even games that don't have an inherent fail state have restrictions, right? Animal Crossing. You can't just do anything anytime. As soon as you start your game, you have a loan debt to pay back to Tom Nook before you can expand your house, right? That's a restriction. But it gives you a goal to work towards, something to do. Otherwise, Animal Crossing would, you know, when you start the game, you would have no reason really to continue playing other than just piddling around and interacting with the characters and fishing and heck, the museum, right? Blathers opens up the museum. You don't just get to view everything in the museum right away. You have to fill it up. That's a restriction that gives you a goal to work towards. Restrictions are necessary for games to exist as games. That's just how it is. You can't, it's not good practice to give no restrictions or little restrictions to anyone or any play style in any game, whether it be player versus environment, solo play, single player versus environment, cooperative, 1v1 player versus player, or team-based player versus player. There has to be some form of restrictions to have any kind of structure, challenge, goals, or depth. Otherwise, you get shallow games that really give no reason to be played, no value. That's pretty much the long and short of it. So that's my thoughts on that. Kind of building off of last week, talking about player freedom. And it's just kind of funny how they feed into each other, you know? Applying the right amount of restrictions in one area actually breeds creativity and player expression and player freedom in other ways. But the wrong kind of restrictions simply takes away from the player's experience and doesn't give them anything back. And that's bad restriction, objectively speaking. Something that if they don't do it, they are just punished for it. But it gives no advantage or no benefits beyond being at baseline capacity when they do, engage with it. It's just not great. And it's just not fun if you're talking about a video game. Now, if you're talking about a simulator, that's a different matter, because those aren't video games in the traditional sense of the medium. Those are meant to imitate reality, and reality is full of restrictions. So that makes more sense. In your racing simulators, you're not going to be, flying or going, breaking the sound barrier. You're not going to be seeing speed lines and cartoonish, smoke effects and whatnot. But if you're playing an arcade, a racing game, Need for Speeds or whatever, you're going to be doing some pretty out there stuff that just wouldn't fly in a racing simulator. But that's fine, because that's what makes them fun games. but you have to have some restrictions, right? Each car has a speed gap. You have, opposition. You have difficulty levels. You have the police or whatever. Restrictions are important. That goes hand in hand with player freedom, and they feed into each other. So you got to find a good balance in order to have a rewarding experience. Single player, multiplayer, cooperative, competitive, whatever. Restrictions and freedom, two sides of the same coin. Definitely can't be made a blanket statement about either of them, and you can't have too much of one over the other. You need to balance the both in the right ways. Don't restrict the player's choices, but don't give them so much power, unrestricted power, that it's trivial, that there's no challenge and no depth. So, if you had anything to add to what I said here, please let me know in the comments on YouTube, in a review on the podcast platform of your choice. Give me some feedback in a review if you'd like. Let me know what you think, how you enjoy the podcast, how my voice sounds, the audio quality and the mixing, all of that good stuff. My release consistency. I've actually been doing this segment weekly. Sai and I have the main feature coming back. We already did one episode this month. We're going to do another one, we did an episode in February. We're going to do another one this month in March, soon. And, on YouTube, like or dislike if you want. Either way, it helps give me good feedback and also helps the video reach more people. And you can also tweet at me with the hashtag counterpick, together as one word, _pod, counterpick _pod. And then you can at me on Twitter at _factor, _factor, _sam, s_factor_sam. And just give me some thoughts. I love engaging with comments and feedback. I enjoy hearing other people's perspectives on things. So let me know if this gave you some interesting things to think about, some thoughts and ideas that you hadn't thought about, or if you have some thoughts and ideas that I didn't mention. I will see you next week. And also, subscribe to the YouTube and the podcast so you can listen to or watch what I release next. I've got my Sonic Frontiers playthrough that's been going up pretty much daily, except for when I, have interspersed VOD trim uploads from my Twitch streams and, episodes of this and the podcast. And then once that's done, I'll be transitioning into something else that I'm going to try to upload, daily, or mostly daily. I want to play through Armored Core 4, which I've already started on stream, but I can't play the game smoothly, stable, while streaming. So I'm going to continue that on YouTube. And I've gotten recently some new information regarding Twitch streams, so I'm might have to adapt and adjust my content creation routines regarding the streams. All right, I'm going to get on with my day. Got some errands to run before I go to work. Hope you have a great day, wherever you are in the world, whether it be morning, noon, afternoon, evening, or night. This has been Samuel Ray, aka Dr. Sam. Have a great one. Later.